The angler-driven study that changed everything in Kentucky. The history: understanding largemouth bass genetics. Largemouth can be found in just about every state and around the world due to their desirability as a sport fish. Northern strain largemouth bass. They are known to be more cold tolerant. Quick growth rates. Easier to catch. Florida strain largemouth bass. Better suited for warmer climates. Known for growing to weights over 10 pounds, possibly 20 pounds. They have a higher winter mortality rate than northern largemouth. F1 first-generation offspring of a pure northern strain and pure Florida strain largemouth. Enhanced characteristics of each parent subspecies. F1s are less susceptible to winter mortality than their Florida strain parent. F1s maintain an extended growth rate over a more extended period of time than their northern strain parent. For those reasons, F1s are a very popular choice for stocking in the Southeast. When did the obsession with growing bigger bass begin? George Perry and his buddy Jack Page set out for a day of fishing on June 2, 1932. The two men kept a boat with one rod, one reel, and one lure in a nearby lake for fishing. George Perry landed his world record largemouth bass from Lake Montgomery and Oxbow Lake in South Georgia. Before the bass got the fillet knife, George took the fish to J.J. Hull's general store. Hull pulled out a tape and measured the fish at 33.5 inches long and 28.5 inches in girth. They then took the fish to the post office and weighed it on a set of certified scales at 22 pounds 4 ounces. Perry's fish was guaranteed to be worth millions today. At the time, Perry won about $75 worth of goods, including a shotgun, some shells, and some clothing from Field and Stream. In 2021, Bassmaster published this article. World record bass suffers case of mistaken identity. Of course, we will never know the ancestry of that fish, but until recently, the assumption was that the fish was a northern strain largemouth or at best a northern/Florida intergrade. Researchers now suggest Perry's fish was probably a pure Florida strain largemouth. How did they get here? By 1900, largemouth had been stocked outside of their native range in 26 states and smallmouth in 20 states. Big bass dreams out west began thanks to the vision of a Californian, spurred by an inquisitive pro baseball player. Orville Ball actually the idea of introducing Florida-bred largemouth after a fishing trip to Florida. Bass are not native to California or even the West Coast. They were first introduced into the state in 1874. The California DFG was initially opposed to the experiment. Orville brought in Dr. David Jessup and other influential sportsmen to fight the issue on the political and bureaucratic levels. Skeptics scoffed at the idea, saying bass in Florida was simply a product of Florida's warm, near-tropical environment. They said, when transported, the Florida bass would become just another bass. Boy, were they wrong. In 1969, the DFW recognized Clear Lake had the potential to become a trophy bass lake. In just 7 years, 52% of all bass in Clear Lake were either Florida Northern Mix or pure Florida bass. By the mid-1980s, all bass in the lake were considered to be carrying the Florida gene. Those early experiments surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. By the 1960s, a new record was established in California over 15 pounds. A 15-pound bass in only 10 years was a fantastic growth rate, especially considering that the original northern bass species had only grown to 14 pounds in nearly 100 years. Who knows if the original record was even a pure northern strain? What do we know about genetics in the rest of the country? Biologists believe natural intergrade populations cover all of Alabama, much of Georgia above the fall line, the majority of Tennessee populations, most of North Carolina and some of Arkansas. In North Carolina, we're seeing no pure Florida or northern populations. This differs considerably from the narrative fisheries scientists Reeve Bailey and Carl Hubbs during the 1940s that intergrades were only native to Georgia and the Florida Panhandle, and the subsequent belief that their presence elsewhere was only the result of Florida stocking. We're finding at least a low level of Florida genes in lakes we haven't stocked. We don't know how they got here. In Virginia, we found that our largemouth populations are made up of fish with northern and Florida genetic traits. All of our populations appear to be mixed. Our fish are F of X, which means they are anywhere from 2nd to 100th generation. In Tennessee, where lakes like Chickamauga have produced record stringers of bass, many lakes also contain Florida genetics. If Florida bass are native to a larger region than peninsular Florida, then our view on transport and stocking may need to change. The F1 used during the 1960s and 70s by state game and fish agencies was a cross between a pure northern and a pure Florida. This is not the same as a tiger bass, which was developed through a selective breeding process to bite artificial lures more readily and to grow at a more rapid rate. There are many so-called F1 bass today, but most are merely an intergrade containing an unknown mixture of Florida and northern genetics. These fish are called intergrades, not hybrids, because they are not a cross of two species but two subspecies. Only the first generation F1 exhibit enhanced growth rates. The idea behind stocking these fish is to enhance the trophy fishery component in our lakes. If we can get fish to a trophy size faster, then theoretically there would be more trophy-sized fish in the lake. In a well-managed setting, tiger bass grow 2 pounds per year. In one Arkansas pond that was well managed for bass, tigers grew to 6.8 pounds in just 2 years. We've also had tigers grow to 15 pounds. But, does it work? The bass fishing bonanza in Lake Chickamauga began when the TWRA began stocking Florida strain largemouth in the lake. More than 2 million Florida bass fingerlings have been released into the lake. A 2013 study of largemouth bass in Lake Chickamauga by the TWRA using genetic samples from 50 trophy-sized fish caught by local competitors and anglers showed that nearly all of the fish were a mix of Florida and northern strain. On February 13, 2015, Gabe Keane caught a 15-pound 3-ounce largemouth. Stocking program appears to be providing greater trophy bass potential at Smith Mountain Lake. Largemouth are the most targeted fish at Smith Mountain Lake, accounting for millions of dollars spent in the local economy each year. A consistent trophy fishery would expand and draw more anglers to the region. DWR says they are seeing an improvement of size in largemouth caught in Smith Mountain and that there are more bass in excess of 4 pounds than there have been in years. Are tiger bass the key to growing trophy largemouth in the Mid-South? The goal is to achieve similar results that have been experienced with F1 stockings in states like Texas and Tennessee. One of the biggest goals of this thing is to leave it better than we found it. I've seen what other states are doing and how lakes in Texas and Chickamauga have been doing because of enhanced genetics. That's where all the science is leading. Will tiger bass change Grand Lake fishing? What no one has found out is if they are taken further north of where that Florida genetic pool thrives, will they still show that crazy growth rate? Maybe they will still top out at about 10 pounds because of the shorter growing season. No one knows. What I want to see in 6 to 7 years is tournaments where the big bass are 9 to 12 pounds instead of 6 to 7 pounds. Over time we will be able to look at growth rates of all of these fish, and that is pretty cool. We've been stocking tiger bass in Virginia lakes for a decade. It has been very successful. What about Kentucky? Envious fishermen in Kentucky have watched a trophy bass fishery develop at Chickamauga. Its neighbor Henry County also stocked 300,000 Florida strain fingerlings in Kentucky. Henry County is in Tennessee and home to the famous Paris Landing State Park on Kentucky Lake. When you follow the flow of the Tennessee River down through Alabama and back up into Kentucky, one has obvious questions. Do those fish not inevitably make into Kentucky due to it being downstream of all of these other reservoirs? In response to the request to stock Florida bass in nearby Lake Barkley in Kentucky, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources produced a paper titled, "Why Not Stock Florida Bass in Kentucky?" Here's an excerpt. The risk is too great for us to take a chance on Florida strain stockings. Our northern strain population evolved over a long period of time in Kentucky's climate. We would be mixing genes that are potentially inferior in Kentucky's climate. Most scientists state it takes 1 million generations or more to evolve lasting changes in a species. Northern strain largemouth rarely grow above 10 pounds. In April of 2019, Mark Ward landed a new Kentucky state record bass from Highsplint Lake in Harlan County. The fish weighed 14 pounds 9.5 ounces. The fish shattered the old record. In 1984, Dale Wilson landed a 13-pound 10.4-ounce largemouth in Wood Creek Lake. Were these state records pure northerns? There is no DNA on these fish to our knowledge. The background of our study. Concerned anglers in Paintsville, Kentucky, began asking questions of state fisheries biologists in an attempt to improve Paintsville Lake. Many anglers expressed that the lake was in the worst shape ever. Paintsville Lake was impounded from Paint Creek in 1983 by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It is the major attraction of Paintsville Lake State Park. With steep cliffs and wooded coves along the shoreline, the lake is approximately 1,140 acres. 6 to 8 pounds in 5 largemouth will typically put you in the money in a bass tournament on Paintsville Lake. These bags are usually anchored by one big fish. Bags over 10 pounds seem to become more rare every year. Anglers have the ultimate goal of introducing F1 largemouth bass in Kentucky. Initially, the KDFWR told the group that Kentucky had a pure northern strain population and could risk introducing new genetic material. The group decided to work with fisheries biologist Stephen Barden of Major League Fishing to attempt to swab 100 samples from the East Kentucky Tournament Trail. The Department of Fish and Wildlife had limited DNA studies on our bass populations in Kentucky ever. DNA studies were performed in the 90s and early 2000s, both showed small percentages of Florida genetics. What this study found in Paintsville Lake was eye-opening and potentially changes everything we thought we knew about the lineage of our largemouth bass populations. What was assumed to be a pure northern population wasn't. The swabs proved the existence of Florida genetics, even proved that pure Floridas somehow existed in the lake. There were no instances of pure F1 largemouth. The majority of fish were intergrades containing a mixture of Florida and northern genetics. How did this happen? Without DNA from the Department of Fish and Wildlife over the years, no one knows. If DNA had been monitored over time, perhaps we would know when and where the Florida strain came from. Did anglers move the fish? Did the department unknowingly stock the fish? It is illegal to move fish in most states. It is also important to note the problems being caused by Alabama bass in the South after being moved by anglers. Where do we go from here? Relative weights and an already diverse population indicated other limiting factors according to biologists. Relative weight is an easy-to-measure index of fish condition. Relative weight is the ratio of the actual weight of the fish to what a rapidly growing healthy fish of that same length should weigh. The first step is to improve habitat. Fish, particularly small fish and bait fish, need cover for survival. Last summer, Anglers for Improving Opportunities had our first habitat project in conjunction with the help of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. We installed 61 pieces of habitat, including pallet structures and Shelbyville cube structures. As of last fall, all were holding some bait fish and starting to grow algae, even the plastic. Paintsville Lake contains only gizzard shad at this point. In the 90s, Paintsville Lake also had threadfin shad. Aside from habitat improvement, Anglers for Improving Opportunities is also working to restock threadfin shad in 2023. Through discussions with biologists, we believe threadfin are a viable option to improve our forage base in Paintsville Lake. Threadfin have almost entirely different behavior than gizzard, spawning at different times, potentially 3 times in a season. The number of spawns and behavior make threadfin an ideal choice for improving the forage base. Tight schooling activity means the threadfin can provide a great deal of food for the bass even though they are only 3 to 4 inches long. Largemouth do not feed on one individual shad, but rather engulf dozens at a time when they come up beneath a school. Threadfin are temperature sensitive and you can experience shed kills in water less than 43 degrees. However, deeper lakes provide areas that act as thermal sanctuaries. Threadfin are heavy spawners and a single female can produce 10 to 12,000 eggs. If we are able to re-establish threadfin, we believe we can have an immediate impact on the growth of every fish in the lake. Paintsville Lake is considered oligotrophic and has remained oligotrophic throughout its existence. Fertility is also a challenge and one that can be band-aided in the short term and hopefully improved over time through other changes. The food web starts with primary producers aka phytoplankton. Dissolved nutrients in the water promote blooms of microscopic algae, which in turn provide food larger zooplankton and other invertebrates. The long-term goals of this project are to improve 1. To improve habitat, 2. To improve forage, 3. To improve fertility, and 4. To eventually stock F1 largemouth bass. Does your local lake face similar issues? Did you know there are resources and grant money available through organizations like Friends of Reservoirs? Most state organizations are strapped with a limited budget and limited manpower. A group of anglers can have a great impact and potentially bring groups together to effect positive change. Please follow our Facebook page Anglers for Improving Opportunities. Leave it better than you found it.